So, we've figured out what GDP is and how GDP works. We know that we use indicators to gather information. The folks that decide this, now this is the thing we have to start working on. Who can decide the economy of the whole United States? Well, the president can. So can Congress, the House and the Senate, and the Federal Reserve. We got to get used to the fact that these folks are taking a look at how to make our economy work. And this is why they used to call it political economics, because you can't get by the fact that some people like how a president does one thing or another thing. Some people like how Congress does one thing or another thing. Some people like how the Federal Reserve does one thing or another thing, or not. Okay? So these folks, however, are right there, and they're elected or they're appointed by our folks up here. So that's why we have to take a look, and in an election year especially, what are these guys going to do to our economy? Do we believe that what they're telling us is going to work? Okay? That's why we study Economics 1 or macroeconomics, or what they used to call political economics, the ECO 2013 course, because we're taking a look how people make decisions in a scarcity. In macroeconomics, how do these people make decisions for us? Because we vote them into office. So here's where we need to know if they're doing stuff that is going to make our lives better or not. And that's the important part of understanding this concept of macroeconomics. Now go ahead and grab this stuff out, because what we're going to do is we're going to pull in to a very important thing called a business cycle. Okay? Now, real GDP, that's that first curve that's on this line. All right, we have real GDP going up and down here. And normally it's over time, like, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, 2020. Right? Over time, what is the economy doing? And it's called a cycle because, look, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. But if you look at it, generally, it goes up. And we've experienced that over the last decade, where we were almost not going up at all, and then all of a sudden we went up, skyrocketed, now we're skyrocketing down. Now, for a whole bunch of other different reasons, but we'll get there. Why did we calculate real GDP? Why? Because real GDP is the brain that runs the business cycle, and the business cycle gives us an idea of what is going on in our economy. Okay? So, what's the economy doing? That's what it's looking at. We already saw this in the last chapter. Very bad, 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 good, real bad. Right? So we have two real bads in there that we don't like very much. The thing is the brain, or in other words, those folks in Washington, D.C., what should I do with this information? I'm getting this. Do I leave it alone? Do I help it change? That's where the business cycle starts coming into play. If I need to change it, by what amount and in what direction? So I can leave it alone and go on vacation, or I need to help it and I got to do this. This is where government involvement comes in again. But remember, in this case, they're setting the stage for a successful environment. They're looking how to answer those 5 questions, right? Not the 5 questions, but the 5 goals. They're trying to look at that. The third goal, remember, is improving standard of living. That's what they're there to do. We react to what the business cycle shows us. The business cycle will show it, we'll react to it. So, the black line, or excuse me, the green line there, I guess I got that one first. That's what we call the natural real GDP. They call it the trend or projection. That's the average. Right? Actual real GDP, that's what we computed in the last section. at this time GDP was here, at this time GDP was here. Our section that we produced is probably, you know, something like this because it was all going up. Okay? So we'll produce the real one, and then you'll hit, as a matter of fact, if you put all the actual real GDPs in Excel, you can hit what they call the trend button, and boom, you get the natural real GDP. It gives you an idea that it is going up. So you look at it and you go, well, it's going down now. Yeah, but is it going down a lot? Or should we just leave it alone because it's going to go back up? So here's where macroeconomics and microeconomics differ a little bit. Because in macroeconomics, we can say, hey, sooner or later, it's going to go up. So leave it alone. But then we look at the microeconomics side. Microeconomics goes, yeah, I know sooner or later it's going to go up, but if that's 2 or 3 years, how am I getting fed today? All right, so microeconomics is a little bit more of how do we do stuff today. Now, there are 4 other parts to this. We have what's called the peak of the business cycle. This is when we're at full employment, we're at 100% capacity. Now, the thing about this 100% capacity is, think about you working 52 weeks out of the year, 24/7. Can you do that without breaking down? And the answer is probably no. Nobody could. Machines can't do it either. So we get to this part, darn it, and it is only temporary. Okay? Now, if you're at the top and it's only temporary, where else can you go? And yes, that would be to the bottom. Okay? This is what we call the trough. This is the bottom of the recession. Okay? Now, if you're at the bottom, we can call it an economic downturn. For those in the White House, we don't want to use the word recession. It sounds bad. So we change it to economic downturn. Of course, if you're trying to get into the White House, you call it a recession. And things work out. Now, recession does occur. We do have an actual measurement for it. Our 4 indicators here, GDP, income going into households, that's on your circular flow diagram, employment, and trade. All 6 of those have to decline for 6 months together. If just one of them changes, the 6-month clock starts all over again. But once that starts happening, once the 6 months get there, we go ahead and boom, say, hey, we're in a recession. That was about, if I recall right, somewhere in 2007 for our Great Recession. And about summer or so of 2009, we were out of the Great Recession. Didn't seem like it, but we were, because of our measurement here that decided that. Now, what is a severe recession? Well, nobody really knows, right? We call the Great Recession the one from 2007 to 2009. What's a depression? It's a bigger recession. Okay, so we have no really clue what's going on here. All right, now, we've got the trough, we got the peak. Now the book calls for, when we go from the bottom to the top, we call it recovery. Remember, when we're going from the top to the bottom, we call it an economic downturn or a recession. Now, a lot of economists, and I'm one of those, we look at recovery and we look at it a little differently. We think that recovery goes to where the last peak was. So that's from here to here. This was the top, and we went into that recession, and we went into the recovery. We recovered when we got back here. That's where we started. The rest of it, I call it, and a few others do, expansion. So it'd be like right here, we were at this part of our circular, or our production possibilities curve. Then we went into recession. Then we went into recovery. Then we went into expansion. So that's what that looks like. So I kind of like the idea of expansion because recovery sounds kind of dismal. So expansion sounds like, hey, things are going great. So once we get to the recovery, we go to the expansion, and that gives us, we were at the current peak, We're at the trough. We're at the expansion or recovery, and now we're at the expansion, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now there are causes to this business cycle. They can be political, right? Elections, laws, and wars can go ahead and do this. And we'll get more into this when we hit the fiscal policy chapter. They can be monetary. In other words, the Federal Reserve does something. They can be financial. We're going through that right now with the stock market. They can be infrastructure. Crumbling infrastructure means we can't travel as easily. It costs more to go from point A to point B. Costs go up, economies contract. New infrastructure, costs go down to get from A and B, economies expand. Innovation. Now the thing about innovation is you can't go ahead and say, make me something better, faster, and cheaper tomorrow or else. Okay? It doesn't work that way. Our brains don't work that way. So it's irregular. You can't talk about it or you can't guarantee what's going to happen. That's more a microeconomics topic. But research and development, into energy and drugs, we're looking at that. Those are two types of research and development that we're really into here recently. And there's productivity. Can you get better, faster, and cheaper? Changes on that. Of course, you can also take technology away, which can be another big problem. Yeah, that's the things that can go ahead and cause some of the cycles. Our cycles also can look three different ways. One is we have a volatile cycle, and it kind of looks like this. Remember, the one that's going this way, that's our real GDP. There's our trend, or our natural GDP. Large gaps between these two, and rising growth. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, let's take a look at it this way. It would be like you're working in January, and you're making gobs of money. In June, you're fired. In next January, you're rehired. That's what we're looking at. Can you live your life if we had very volatile hirings and firings? Okay? Answer is probably no. We can also have what's called a stagnant growth. In other words, there's no growth, but we have smaller gaps. We want smaller gaps, but we don't want no growth. Okay? What we want is rapid growth. Now, if you notice, rapid growth has the same small gaps, but it also has the same rising trend line or natural GDP. That's the one we want to get to. So what we want to do is we want to try to reduce those gaps and make this one go this way. So, we talked about GDP. Unemployment rate is the next thing that we're going to go ahead and get into, because it's one of those short-term things that helps us go, unemployment's down, it's going to affect GDP. We need to go ahead and figure out how we're going to fix that. So let's the first thing we need to do is find out what types of employment we have. And there's four basic ones. The first one is called frictional. And this is why we will never have 100% employment. Why? Because it's up to us. We quit. You ever get to a job and say, you know what, I've had it. I'm quit, I'm done, I walk out. That's frictional unemployment. We do it. The second is structural unemployment. And this is all of us taking this course. Because we want to figure out how to do things better, faster, and cheaper. In other words, businesses restructure themselves to reduce costs and or increase revenue all the time. That's one of the things you're hired to do. So structural unemployment. So there's another reason we will never have 100% employment. Okay? And remember, structural unemployment brings in the concept of creative destruction when we do that. Now, cyclical unemployment. Literally, as GDP goes down, we're not buying so much. It's kind of like you look at the restaurant and the restaurant's half empty. The restaurant owner isn't going to keep a full staff if the restaurant's half empty. So cyclical unemployment looks at if the cycle's going down, we're hiring people, or excuse me, we're firing people. Cycle goes up, all of a sudden we have a full restaurant and our wait staff can't keep up, so we have to hire more. So the cycle goes up, we hire more people. Now the last of the four is seasonal. Okay? October, early November, you see signs on all the stores. Nope, they don't say sale. But what they do say is now hiring, temporary hiring, temp help needed. Why? Because we're getting into the busy sales season. So it's seasonal. Fall and winter, we're hiring people all over the place to take up the extra demand. Of course, January comes around, and what happens? We don't need them anymore. So they're let go. Then, of course, up comes summer. We've got all those lifeguards out at the beach, all those temp jobs for college students. But come fall, they all go away. So, frictional, structural, cyclical, and seasonal unemployment. Those are the types. But now that we know the types, we need to know how to calculate unemployment. You know, we hear that, oh, unemployment is 5.6%, 3.4%, whatever percent they throw out there. We need to figure out how it's calculated. And it's done by dividing up our population into two groups. Those that are not in the labor force and those that are in the labor force. The ones that are in the labor force, those are the ones that we're looking for our unemployment numbers. So let's find out who is not in the labor force. First off, if you're under 16, you don't count. You can be the Richie Rich kid that you're 14 and you're running a multi-billion-dollar business, but you don't count as working because you are not in the labor force. The next, institutionalized. Right? Folks that, for some reason or other, are behind some kind of a door where they do not have the freedom to go in and out. Right? You don't have the freedom to go to work. So, you're not considered in the labor force. Also, if you're in the military, you say, well, wait a minute, they're making bucks all over the place. You're right, but we don't have the freedom to go ahead and say we don't want to be in the military anymore. So, military does not count. Also, retired. By definition, if you're retired, you're not working. So retired doesn't count. Or homemakers. Remember we said, hey, they may be doing a whole lot of stuff, but it's not being purchased in a market. So they don't count. Also, full-time students. I said full-time. Because if you are full-time, you're supposed to be studying, not partying. Right? So full-time students count, part-time students do not. You go, well, wait a minute, I'm going full-time and working. Yes, I did that too. So, full-time doesn't count. And then my favorite are the discouraged workers. These are the ones that used to work or have been trying to look for work, but they can't, they just gave up. Right? You know all those folks that are sitting there 24/7 at home on their Game Boys and everything else, and that's all they do. And they complain about not being able to find a job. Well, that's the first kind. The second kind of discouraged worker, let's say you used to be the best at what you're doing. You got fired. Right? You go ahead, you get your resume set up, and the next week you're out there hitting every place you can possibly find, but there's no work. Next week, you might not go every day. Maybe you go every other day. No work. Now maybe you go 2 days a week. No work. You know, it's kind of like how much time hitting your head on the wall before you just go, ugh, I'm done. Okay? Discouraged. So discouraged workers come in, you know, a lot of different ways. They're not just deadbeats. But those are the 7 key parts that are not in the labor force. Okay? That's the one hitting his head on the wall. Now, in the labor force, we have 2 groups. Ones that are employed. Now, here's the key. You are employed if you worked at least 1 hour during a week. You were employed for that week. 1 hour is all you have to work. Or you're unemployed, which means you're not working but you're looking for work. That's the difference between unemployed and discouraged. Discouraged, yeah, they're not working, but they're not looking for work. Unemployed, yeah, they're not working, but they are looking for work. So, questions about that? Take a good look, make sure you know the 9 different groupings of who is in and who is not in the labor force. Why? Because first off, here's a homework sheet, check the homework folder. You got 1 through 7, tell me who's in the working force, who's not in the workforce, and why, or excuse me, the labor force. All right, now let's take a good look at how we come up with the unemployment percentage formula. It's real simple. We only use the 2 groups in the labor force. The first part is the unemployed. They're on this side of our divider. Right? So they're here. The full labor force is here, which means the employed and the unemployed are here. So the unemployed are actually here in 2 different places. So it's unemployed divided by labor force times 100, because we always see it in a percentage. That gives us our unemployment percentage. So how do they figure this out? Well, once a month, there's about 60,000 telephone calls made. And you go ring, ring, you pick up the phone. Hey, you working? Yes, I am. Thank you very much. Click. You're employed. Hey, you working? Nope. You looking for work? Yep. Thank you very much. Click. You're unemployed. Or any of the other 7 categories that identifies you not being in the labor force. So those 60,000 phone calls in statistically accurate sampling areas come up and make this unemployment percentage. Now at this time, you should be going, man, that doesn't sound too good. Well, remember, we're talking about macroeconomics. Horseshoes, hand grenades, nuclear weapons. All we need to do is get in the ballpark. We're not accountants. We don't have to do things to the penny, right? In the ballpark. So the question is it good enough? And the answer is yes, because we've been using this for decades. Now, there's a couple of different kinds of unemployment numbers, and we may talk about those towards the end of the class, or categories, I should say, of different calculations. That some say, well, maybe we should be using this one instead of that one. Well, this is the one that's working, and it works very well in something called Okun's Law. All right, so we've got 46.3 million employed. We've got 38.2 million part-time. We've got 7 million not working but looking for work. We've got 10 million not working and not looking for work. What I want you to do here is 2 things. First is figure out which one of those go into which part of the formula, and then do the formula. So go ahead and pause the recording and go ahead and do that, and then come back when you're done. Okay, here's what we're looking at. Employed, 146.3 million. Yes, that's one of the numbers we use. Part-time workers. Oops, wait a minute. That's part of the employed number. So it's already in that 146.3. Not working but looking for work. That's the definition of unemployed. Not working and not looking for work, that's discouraged workers, so we don't even bother with them. So our formula, we take the 7 here, we take the 146.3 plus the 7 here. We add these together, we divide these, we come up with 0.46 and multiply it by 100. We have a 4.6 unemployment rate with these numbers, okay? Now, why do you have 4 instead of just 2? Because I've actually seen this on TV too, where some of the talking heads are saying, hey, we got this employed, we got part-time, we've got folks not looking, we got folks working, looking for work, and all of this, they're trying to tie into the unemployment rate, and half of them aren't. So here's where you reason for understanding and knowing the 7 parts that are not in the labor force and the 2 that are, is so when you see a talking head on TV, mentioning all of this stuff, you can go ahead and say, well, maybe that's not quite right. All right, so questions on this one? Hey, here's your homework. All right, so again, it's in the homework folder. Now, we take a look at our real GDP, and here's our actual unemployment rate. You notice that it's almost 180 degrees different. As we get into a recession, the unemployment rate goes up. Well, yeah, as we're starting to let people go, we should have a higher unemployment rate. So it basically looks like this. Now, remember the 4 types of unemployment, and we said that there's no way we would ever have full employment. So what happens is when we take a look at this force that's not in there, the government defined a natural unemployment rate. Now, for different things, they've got it between 4 to 8%, but generally speaking across the country, every policy that's going on in Washington, D.C. is focusing on, we're going to have a 5% unemployment rate. Everybody goes, well, we can't do that. We got to have, everybody has to have a job. Well, remember, we quit. They can't tell us not to quit. And managers and owners try to do things better, faster, and cheaper, structural unemployment. So that's also going to put people in the unemployment lines. So that's why we have a natural unemployment rate of 5%, because that's what is focused in when we start actually doing reality on what's going on out there. We cannot do that. Government can't tell you you can't quit. Government can't tell you quit making things better, faster, and cheaper. Right? They can't tell you that in a capitalist society. Right? They can in a socialist economic system. All right, so what should we, meaning the President, Federal Reserve, or Congress, do? Should we leave something alone or help it change? Well, we'll actually take a look at this leaving it alone or helping it change when we get into the aggregate demand chapter. If we decide what is it are we going to do? Remember, we're talking about these folks, the policymakers. All of their policies, they're trying to nudge us to do something, right? Sometimes they actually plain out come and say, this is what's going to happen, but that rarely happens. We find out later. Remember Nancy Pelosi's thing of, well, we have to pass the bill to see what's in the bill. I thought their job was to read the bill and find out if it was good or bad before they voted on it, before they passed the bill. Well, apparently not. Anyway, this is what we're looking at. These are our policymakers. Now, here's part of the problem. We know we want to be here, but we're here. How do we get there? Right? How do we find the target? It can be a real mess. This is where a guy by the name of Arthur Okun came up with this concept of Okun's Law. Yeah, he's still alive, and he still has that pipe and does his thing. I don't know if he smokes it anymore, but he still has the pipe. But he came up with a concept because his research, and here's another worksheet for you to go ahead and grab out. He spent a lot of time looking at gaps in real and potential GDP and gaps in actual and natural unemployment. And through the years, his research found out that for every 1% gap between here or here, there was a 2% gap between here or here. Right? 1% between real and natural unemployment, there's a 2% gap between real and potential GDP, here and here. That's what he found out. That's what his research found out. And you go, okay, big deal. But it is. Right? We want to go ahead and reduce the gaps. He found out how to do it. All right? And he did it in this way. Now, we call the gaps two different things. If it's below the natural real GDP curve, or we could also call it the potential real GDP, we call this a recessionary gap. Right? Yeah, Why? Because down we're going into a recession. Here we're recovering, but we're still recovering from a recession. Up here it's an inflationary gap because we're spending more and more and more than the average says we should. Right? Remember, this is the data up to this point. This is our natural curve up to this point. This is potentially what we should be doing. So we can have an idea of some of that. And this is where Okun came in, and his law, stating this, came up with a way to find out, because remember, this is all potential. We don't know if it's going to keep going that way. But if you measure this part and you measure this part, you take a look at the two gaps, you take a look at what the numbers of GDP are, you can actually figure out if you're here where you should be. And that's a target that we can now figure out, how do we employ this many more people? Because if we employ them, it's going to bring GDP out of this rut, out of the recession, and get it back to natural. So that's what it's looking to do, and that's what he found out. So we now have, we got to employ people so that we can increase GDP, so that we can get it back to where it should be. All right, that's the whole point. Remember, it's hard to hit a target, but now he came up with an actual formula that we can do it. All right, so if there's 1% difference here between 5 and this one, there's a 2% difference between here and here. So let's look at that. That's the law, but let's take a look at what we actually have. So we'll grab one of those Okun's Law math sheets, and we're going to work just on this top part first. And the first thing we're going to look at is 3.8 and $15.3 trillion. Unemployment rate is 3.8%. Actual GDP is 15.3 trillion. Okay? So let me see here. Okay. All right, so it's 3.3, and we know that for every 1% gap, it's 2 here. So what do? We multiply this one by 2. Right? There's our by 2. And we get that there's a 6.6 gap there. Now, if we know how much is here, we multiply that by 6.6, and we know how much we have to increase spending to get these people hired. So let's take a look at that worksheet. We have actual unemployment, 8.3%. Actual real GDP, 15.3. Those are the ones I gave you. Okun's Law, for every 1% gap between natural and real, there's a 2% gap between real and potential. That's his law. Natural unemployment rate, 5%, decided by the government. So those two areas is all givens. Now we take a look and do the math. 8.3%, 5% natural unemployment. How did we figure out the gap? Well, we subtracted this from that, and we came up with 3.3%. Now, you have to double that. Remember that 2%, so we multiply that 3.3 to 6.6, and we go ahead and we get a percentage. All right, now here's something I put in because percentages sometimes cause people to not be able to use their calculators right. So if you multiply that 6.6 by 0.01, you get this. You've now turned the percentage into an actual number. So we can use the number now. Now, any of this shouldn't have been a problem. I gave you the top two numbers. Okun's Law gave you that one number, and government gave us natural unemployment. Now we just plug them in to these various spots. You can see the different color codes on where they go. Now, let's take a look at getting to our target spending that we have to spend. So what should the actual GDP, 15.3, goes in there? 15.3 times that 0.066 gives us $1 trillion. Or in other words, to get rid of that 8.3%, bring it back down to 5, we have to increase spending by $1 trillion. That trillion we put here, this 1 trillion is the target spending increase because it's positive. If it was negative, we'd have to decrease. So it's an increase. We cross this one out. That must happen if we are to eliminate the 3.3% unemployment gap and get our economy where it should be, potential GDP. So simple math. You got the numbers, and it gives you a target of what you need to shoot for. And here's where Congress comes in, because hey, they can go ahead and spend that money or authorize that money to be spent. But Okun went ahead and came up with a formula to do it. Now, this isn't the only thing that they use targets on, but they do go ahead and confirm the other information. You know, it's kind of like you're trying to make a decision and you're using all different information sources. This is one of the information sources they give you. All right. 6.6% gap. We started at 15.3 trillion. To get up here, we need to increase it by another $1 trillion. That's what we're looking at. That's how we got it. That's what it looks like. This is where Okun came in. 3.3% gap times 2, 6.6%, times the 15.3 trillion. We need a $1 trillion to increase us from here to here. And if we do that, unemployment goes from here to here. So now we have to do, the government has to figure out how much are we going to spend. All right, questions on that one? If you do, get to me, because you have 2 homework assignments. You got this one and you got that one. All right, so go ahead and use the sheets if you have to. I mean, just you know, fill them out and put them back in. All right. Now, to maintain employment, for everybody that wants a job, we have to grow our economy. Why? Because our population grows. We started out with 1, we got 3, we've got this many, we've got this many. All of a sudden, our population keeps growing. We don't shrink too much. And if it doesn't grow with natural childbirth inside the country, it grows with immigration. If we need that many people to produce this much stuff, we're going to need that many jobs available to make all of that. But what happens here? We need to go ahead and grow that some more. Now, rule of thumb says that will happen if we can grow 150,000 new full-time jobs per month. Not part-time, but full-time. That gets to be a little bit of a problem nowadays. Why? Because we got new workers coming in all the time. High school graduates, technical school graduates, college graduates, immigrants, people that are turning 16 that don't have an education. We got all these people wanting a job. We also have folks that are returning workers. They voluntarily got out. Hey, maybe somebody had a baby and they decided to stay home for a while. Now they're getting back in. Or they were involuntarily pushed out. They were fired. Now they're looking for a new job. All of these means we need to have at least 150,000 new full-time jobs per month so that all of our new workers have the opportunity to have a job. Now that equates to somewhere around 3.5% GDP growth. Now we haven't had that in a long time, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why, but we're getting more towards that than we used to be. Oops. All right, now remember I said that's a rule of thumb. Now this is a great big whole thing of, gee, what's a rule of thumb and all that kind of stuff. Rule of thumb is just generally what most economists look at. Okay? Now we can have some misleading signals. We're deep in a recession, and all of a sudden the unemployment number goes down. Say, oh, unemployment is going down. Right? Instead of 12.8, it's now 12.3. We're coming back. Does it show a stronger economy? It might, or it might show that a lot of workers decided to stop looking for work. So they're no longer part of that formula, which means it looks better than it actually is. Or we have a rising GDP and the unemployment rate goes up. oh man, we're heading this direction, but all of a sudden now, unemployment, it was 10.8, it's now 11.3. Why? Because discouraged workers are now seeing help wanted signs and they're going back into the labor force. So it makes the labor force bigger. So for a while, you're going to see that little bit of a bump. So either one of these can go ahead and be a misleading signal. So you got to just take a look at what's actually going on. Now, this is what your sheet should look like. You got everything in there we've talked about. And that's all for this section.